Were women truly prisoners of their time, trapped in a web of societal expectations and religious decrees? Or did they carve out surprising spaces of agency, even within the confines of convents and the watchful eyes of church councils? Let's dive into the surprisingly messy, often contradictory, and occasionally scandalous world of medieval women, not the idealized saints of illuminated manuscripts, but the real women who lived, worked, and argued their way through a world determined to limit them. It started, predictably, with money. The 14th century was a brutal economic time, and London, a burgeoning city, was a pressure cooker of poverty and opportunity. A woman's worth early on was largely determined by her ability to earn. The first glimpse of this reality comes from a 1393 proclamation, a surprisingly blunt decree about harlots and procuresses. These women, essentially sex workers and their handlers, were deemed a public nuisance, a breeding ground for scandals and great peril. The city's elite, it seems, weren't thrilled about the potential for a ruined reputation or a drunken brawl fueled by cheap ale and loose tongues. But hold on, this wasn't just about moral condemnation. The city's legal system was obsessed with punishment, and the punishment for these women was peculiar. The thewe, a kind of public humiliation device resembling a chair, was a fate worse than prison. Imagine being forced to sit for an hour a day, exposed to the jeers of the crowd. It was a potent message: don't do this, don't become this, and it wasn't just about deterring prostitutes. The proclamation aimed to scare everyone, women, and particularly Flemish women, who were frequently blamed for everything from bad weather to social unrest, into keeping a low profile. Think of it as a medieval version of a keep out sign, plastered across the city with public shaming. Then there's Simon de Canterbury, a carpenter, diligently sketching out plans for a townhouse. It wasn't a grand palace, just a modest dwelling, but it was a testament to a man's ambition and a glimpse into the everyday lives of the wealthy. He was building a hall, a room, a larder, the essentials of a respectable home. And here's the kicker: he was paying for it all down to the locks with his own money. No family fortune, no inherited wealth, just a man working hard to create a space for himself. This wasn't a story of aristocratic privilege, it was a story of self-reliance, a rare commodity in a society where women's roles were largely defined by their relationships to men. Let's move on to the world of the church. The official stance on women was complicated. Church councils, those gatherings of bishops and theologians, were fiercely debating the role of women. The decree from the Council of Orange in 441 was unambiguous: deaconesses of any sort shall not be ordained. It wasn't a progressive statement, it was a firm rejection of an idea that had briefly gained traction. The idea of female clergy, even as low-ranking officials like deaconesses, was considered too dangerous, too disruptive to the established order. But the reality on the ground was often different. The Council of Arles, just a few decades later, reaffirmed the ban on women holding positions of authority, but acknowledged that some women had already been ordained. The punishment for violating this rule: excommunication, a fate worse than death in the medieval world. And the Council of Epon in 517 went even further, explicitly forbidding the consecration of widows as religious figures, citing the example of Ananias and Sapphira, who had tried to deceive the church with a false offering. It was a stark reminder that honesty and transparency were paramount. Now let's talk about the women who did choose the religious life, the nuns. Caesarius of Arles, a 7th century bishop, penned the first rules specifically for nuns, a document that became a blueprint for countless convents across Europe. It wasn't a utopian vision of spiritual bliss, it was a set of practical guidelines, a framework for managing a community of women dedicated to prayer and service. But even within the cloistered walls of a convent, women faced restrictions and expectations. Caesarius' rule emphasized obedience, humility, and a strict avoidance of worldly possessions. Nuns were forbidden from owning their own clothes, from having private accommodations, or from engaging in activities that could be seen as worldly. They were to live in communal rooms, share beds, and perform manual labor tasks that might seem unremarkable today, but were considered highly unusual for women of any social standing. And the money situation, don't even get me started. Caesarius rules stipulated that widows entering the convent had to surrender all their assets, a symbolic act of detachment from the material world. It was a radical idea, suggesting that true spiritual fulfillment didn't come from wealth, but from a selfless devotion to God. However, it was a difficult requirement, particularly for women who had inherited property or who were still responsible for their families. The rules surrounding marriage were equally complex. A woman could enter the convent as a bride, a widow, or a virgin, but each path came with its own set of conditions. If a woman remarried after entering the convent, she faced excommunication, a fate that would effectively ostracize her from the church. It was a powerful deterrent, designed to ensure that women remained committed to their vows. But the religious life wasn't just about rules and regulations. It was also about community, about shared experiences, and about the pursuit of spiritual knowledge. Nuns studied scripture, wrote letters, and engaged in acts of charity. They formed close bonds with one another, offering support and companionship in a world where women's lives were often isolated and precarious. The 14th century brought new challenges to the religious life, as the Black Death ravaged Europe and disrupted the social order. Convents were often overwhelmed with the sick and the dying, and nuns risked their own lives as they cared for the afflicted. Despite the devastation, however, the religious life persisted, providing a refuge for women who sought solace and meaning in a time of great uncertainty. The final layer of this intricate picture is the world of the city itself. Town buildings weren't just residences, they were commercial hubs, blending living spaces with businesses. A carpenter like Simon de Canterbury wasn't just building a house, he was building a business, a livelihood. And the people who lived and worked in these buildings, owners, servants, apprentices, represented a diverse range of social classes and occupations. The city's authorities were constantly grappling with problems related to public order and morality. The proliferation of harlots and procuresses was a major concern, as it was believed to contribute to crime, violence, and social disorder. The city's response was often draconian, involving public shaming, fines, and imprisonment. But it's important to remember that these measures were not simply about enforcing moral standards. They were also about maintaining control and preserving the city's reputation. Consider the stews or bathhouses, where women could seek refuge from the grime and pollution of the city. These establishments were often associated with prostitution and other forms of vice, but they also provided a space for social interaction and entertainment. The city's authorities attempted to regulate the stews, imposing restrictions on their hours of operation and demanding that they maintain a certain level of cleanliness. And then there were the hucksters, peddlers who traveled from town to town, selling their wares in the city's taverns and brewhouses. These men were viewed with suspicion, as they were often associated with drunkenness and gambling. The city's authorities issued proclamations prohibiting them from soliciting customers at night, a measure designed to curb public disorder. So, what do we learn from this tangled web of regulations, decrees, and personal stories? It's clear that medieval women's lives were shaped by a complex interplay of social, economic, and religious forces. They faced numerous restrictions and limitations, but they also found ways to assert their agency, to carve out spaces of independence, and to contribute to society in meaningful ways. Were they prisoners of their time? Perhaps in some ways. But they were also survivors, innovators, and agents of change. They were women who defied expectations, challenged authority, and left their mark on the medieval world. But what about the women who didn't fit neatly into these categories? The undocumented, the marginalized, the forgotten. What about the women who lived on the fringes of society, struggling to survive in a world that offered them little opportunity? Their stories are lost to the archives, their voices silenced by history. And finally, as we conclude this exploration of medieval women's lives, let's ask ourselves, what can we learn from their experiences? How can we honor their resilience, their courage, and their determination? And how can we ensure that their stories are not forgotten?